He was a mass murdering dictator who brutally oppressed his own people. There's this stripping of Arab people of agency.
That's key.
And, you know, because people bring up...
Do you think some white Western leftists are guilty of that?
I think it's racism. If you look at the polling of the Palestinians detest Assad.
The very same hawks on Syria will be happy for Jelani and HTS to be like brought in from the cold. But Hamas? Oh my God.
It's not Israel, it's illegally occupied Syrian land. Most of our media won't say they've even invaded, will they?
Owen, they're creating a buffer zone for their buffer zone.
For their buffer zone. And then they'll need another buffer zone for the former buffer zone.
I'm Mehdi Hasan.
I'm Owen Jones.
And we are too outspoken. Good to see you, Owen.
Great to see you.
Very
cash.
You can't. It's been cash for a year. You can't keep doing the cash thing.
Do I keep doing the cash thing?
I don't think I've ever interviewed you in a suit and tie.
No, I guess it wouldn't really be becoming of either of us, maybe.
Maybe.
Formality.
When was the last time you wore a suit and tie?
Well, actually, I went to a wedding this weekend, so I had to wear some sort of suit. Didn't I? Not a tie, but...
I knew. I was waiting for that. I went to a wedding, but you didn't wear a tie, did you?
Tie.
You're such a rebel. You went to the wedding just in a suit.
Well,
was it even a suit, or was it just a blazer?
Actually, it's embarrassing. I forgot to dry clean it, so I had to go to two different shops. They didn't even match. So actually, this is blown up my face.
I knew it. As you said it, I felt this story was going to blow up. No suit, no tie. So what was
socks.
So let me be the interviewer that I am. Pretend I'm wearing a suit and tie, and say follow-up question: when was the last time you wore a suit and tie? I'm panicking now. I'm starting to have a little meltdown because for my wedding, I got silver partnered a few months ago, and I still did not wear a tie for that either. I don't think ties. So all you're doing is giving examples of where you haven't worn.
Ties are out though. I think ties aren't really the done thing anymore. I think ties are kind of like 90s, aren't they? No. We're not in the 90s anymore, Mehdi.
So. I don't think all ties have been dismissed to the 1990s. I think that's a ridiculous excuse.
When do you wear a tie?
I wore a tie about 30 minutes ago.
Why?
When I was interviewing Hamza Yusuf.
Oh, I see. Why? So he gets a level of deference I don't?
Yeah. Okay. He's a former First Minister of Scotland. You're a Guardian columnist.
Just some little gobshite looks a bit like
Macaulay
Culkin.
Zeteo, an author. You're actually a very well-qualified individual, but I don't think you merit a suit and tie. All right, let's talk about something serious. Syria.
Oof, that is serious.
It's been a big story. Well, just when we thought the year was coming to an end, you and I have talked about Lebanon on this show. We talked about Gaza. By the way, last time I talked to you about Lebanon, we were in London. And here I'm back in London. We're talking about Syria because 2024 couldn't come to an end without another major historic event / news story, which is the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Huge story. The Syrian civil war has been going on over a decade. It had been quiet for a few years. There had been no real movement on the front line since 2020. And then in 11 days, Syrian opposition groups led by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and al-Qaeda offshoot, toppled one of the world's worst dictators. And even that statement, one of the world's worst dictators, to some on the left is provocative. This whole Syria debate for me has been very difficult over the last decade and a half. It's been one of these ones where people have ended friendships and accused each other of being either pro-dictator or pro-terrorist. It's lacked nuance. It's divided Muslims up, Sunni versus Shia. It's divided the left up. I don't even want to come up with names for what the different factions on the left are. But where do you stand on all this? I feel like you have taken a nuanced view on Syria and taken a bit of heat for it, as have I.
I'm dreading this, to be honest. I'm dreading the response to this because, my view is...
Did you celebrate on Saturday night when you heard Assad had fallen?
I was a bit ill at the time, but I had this esophagitis. Don't recommend it.
Are you feeling better?
I'm feeling much better. He was a mass murdering dictator who brutally oppressed his own people, who overwhelmingly are rejoicing in his overthrow. There's no question about that. Look, I think the way I'd look at it is, I opposed all the Western military interventions.
So did I.
In Syria and elsewhere. And that's my view. And I'm interested in is this kind of anti-imperialist tradition, if you like, which I see myself very much in. And that is this view historically that the great powers carved up the world between themselves, stole their resources, enslaved their people, subjected them to genocides, horrors, famine. India had the same level of living standards as England before it was taken over by the British, subjected to multiple famines. People should read late Victorian Holocausts. The last famine was 1943 before independence. So many horrors such as that, Palestine being an example of that legacy. And then the understanding of the anti-imperialist tradition...
Or as Jack Straw, Tony Blair's foreign secretary, once famously said, I fly around the world trying to resolve conflicts that we started.
Very good way of putting it. And it's not just the shadow of all that. those people fought back and liberated themselves from colonialism. But then, as an anti-imperialist, you understand that new forms of imperialism and neo-colonialism were set up, rigging the economic order in favour of the same global north countries, which enslaved and occupied much of the world.
With client states.
My parents, when I was, before I was born in the 70s, brought in Chilean refugees because in Latin America, of course, the overthrow of Allende, Kissinger said, we will not let people go communist because of the irresponsibility of their own people. Iran, Mossadegh, 1953. We could go on. And then more recently, things like Iraq and so on. There was this, for me, there was a book this made a big influence on me by Peter Fryer, who was he was in the Communist Party in the 1950s, and he worked for the Daily Worker, their newspaper. And he went to Hungary in 1956, and this is when the Soviets invaded. Yep. And he went there as a very pro-Soviet man. And then he saw the reality of the Hungarian Revolution and its brutal suppression. And he spoke about how Stalinism was Marxism with the heart cut out, ossified, stripped of humanity. And I do think there was a tradition which sprung out of that kind of, sometimes known as tankies because of the literal Soviet tanks marching into Hungary, which divorced anti-imperialism from a broader project of human liberation and emancipation. And it is right to look at the brutality of imperialism as it dominates the world, but it isn't the only horror that exists. And Bashar al-Assad, who, a brilliant young journalist, wrote a piece for The Guardian many years ago, named Mehdi Hasan, spoke about how Bashar al-Assad's regime cooperated with the West in the so-called war on terror. Rendition, etc. In the 2000s, with his investment banker partner wife, introduced neoliberalism, privatised education, health, cut social security and all the rest of it. And then in the context of a drought, and then, of course, the Arab Spring, a uprising against him, he militarised the response, intentionally promoted the likes of ISIS, by the way, in order to...
So I'm going to jump in and say, that the counter-narrative, just for fairness, is to say, well, no, it wasn't an organic uprising. The CIA spent a ton of money to do regime change in Syria, Operation Timber Sycamore. It was one of the most expensive CIA covert operations in the history of the agency. You had a bunch of Gulf countries, to quote Joe Biden, sending money in to support the rebels. And this is where it all gets so complicated, because I feel like there's multiple truths. Like, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can accept that Bashar al-Assad was a horrible dictator who repressed his people and crushed an uprising, but outside powers did get involved cynically and armed some awful groups, including groups we were supposed to be against. Like
Operation Timber... Sycamore. That was 2012, 2013. That was after the rebels. Yes. I mean, it needs to be clear because, the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, which was a Western-backed dictatorship. Yeah. And obviously...
And then Egypt another Western-backed
dictatorship. Because this idea the Arab Spring was just and there's this stripping of Arab people of agency.
That's key.
And, because people bring up...
Do you think some white Western leftists are guilty of that?
I think it's racism. And I think there is a form of anti-Arab racism, which I think, in fact, not all of them. I mean, I'm not saying that about sweepingly, but I've seen some. I've seen some people responding calling me Jihadi Jones. I get called out by pro-Israel fanatics, about Hamas, and now they're saying that I support ISIS or whatever. I mean, what are they talking about? And the danger of that is so many Muslim people in Britain and elsewhere, not least in Syria, are very happy about what's happened. And the danger of that narrative is you're going to start stigmatizing a lot of Muslims in the same way as Dick Cheney did.
Well, you're stigmatizing a lot of Muslims as being extremists simply because they support Muslim groups. But also you're dividing up a pro-Palestinian coalition, right? That's a big problem because some of the people, we're not getting into all the names here because I can't be bothered to have fights on social media after this airs, but they know who they are. A lot of people who are very pro-Palestine, very anti-Israel, were also pro-Assad.
Which is very bizarre, by the way, because a lot of those, I'm not using Hamas as some sort of endorsement here, but the Hamas knew where the Palestinian people in Gaza were at, which is why in 2012, when they went to Damascus, they refused to back Assad. They were kicked out of Damascus, and they came out and openly supported the Syrian uprising. And in fact, they released a statement doing the same thing, welcoming his overthrow. And if you look, the reason they did that is if you look at the polling of the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, every single poll, including not least polls by Palestinian organizations, finds that Palestinians detest Assad. And it's not because the reason that's important to say that is he's being portrayed as this fighter against Zionism and imperialism.
Axis of resistance, which I want to come back to in a moment. You're right about that. And we'll talk about the axis of resistance. Before we get to that, I would just say there are double standards on all sides again. And I think you and I, in particular, should be outspoken about that. You've got certain people who were pro-Palestinian or are pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel for the last 14 months, calling out the horrors of airstrikes on hospitals and schools. But in the Syrian context, we're fine with Assad and Russia bombing hospitals and schools.
Do you know what's even worse?
Do you know
what's even worse than that? Do you know what's even worse than that? As some Syrian activists have been at the forefront, on social media opposing the genocide that Israel is committing against Palestinian people, as they pointed out, sometimes those people have accidentally used videos from Syria of Assad or the Russian army. And that's so insane because there is no shortage of footage of war crimes because Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians. That this for me is, it's about consistency.
So on the consistent front, what I'm saying is that on the left, terminology is going to be a problem today. Whatever you want to call it, on the pro-Palestine side, you have some people who are pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, very prominent activists, influencers, social media folks. But then when it comes to Syria, they're pro-Assad, which I find inconsistent morally and politically. But then on the quote-unquote establishment side, on the Western government side, there's massive inconsistency. So Hamas are beyond the pale, as bad as ISIS. But HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a literal offshoot of Al-Qaeda, is given the benefit of the doubt. They get nice write-ups in the newspapers, on CNN, and the British government, Keir Starmer's talking about, there'll be a time when we may have to delist them, which, by the way, I'm fine with, right? I'm coming from a tradition where you talk to terrorist groups, you talk to your opponents. That's how you moderate them. That's how you end the threat from the IRA or whatever it is. And if you can do that to an Al-Qaeda offshoot, fine. I'm skeptical that they fully change, but I want to see it. I want to see the process happen. But what I find ironic is the inconsistency. The very same hawks on Syria will be happy for Jolani and HTS to be brought in from the cold, but Hamas, oh my God!
It just shows actually the talk about Western imperialism. It's inconsistent. Let's put it that way. History. Its relationship with various forms of Islamism, Islamist insurrectionist movements. The most infamous example, of course, Afghanistan, from the 1970s onwards,
where they were villains, heroes.
And what they did actually is they funneled support often through the Pakistani secret services, ISI, which often went to the most extreme groups. I would know.
But then they disowned it all.
And then they disowned it, and then it was all blowback.
Can I tell you my favourite, very quick disowned story? Rambo 3. Are you a fan of the Rambo movies?
No, I see. It's the opening credit bit, isn't it?
No, it's the end credits of Rambo 3 where he says this is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen. And I believe they took that out of later versions because they realised those brave Mujahideen were the people then who allegedly were involved.
It was Saudi Arabia. I mean, look, Saudi Arabia is one of the most repressive regimes on earth. They, behead people.
A close ally of the West.
Exactly, and have exported a lot of the.
But Assad is evil. I mean, this is So this is.
But he wasn't evil for a while. But Tony Blair wanted to give him a knighthood.
He had tea with the Queen.
He comes in, very socially awkward
guy.
So
basically what we're saying today is there is a fuckload of inconsistency on the imperialist side and the anti-imperialist side.
But we need to be careful here because we don't want to both sides it and make it sound like they're both of an equal power and worth. Because a lot of this is, let's be honest, people on Twitter, rather than people who run the world.
Yes.
and the fact that, it is important that I think, on the left, it is important we keep our house in order and we have, a universal emancipatory project which is about freeing people from all forms of oppression and violence, wherever that comes from.
What would you say
they're the ones at the people who, the United States of America, they pick and choose. This is what they did with Saddam Hussein. For a long time, he was our son of a bitch, as I think the CIA called him. They armed him to the teeth when he gassed the Kurds, which then later became the most evil thing he'd ever done. We were supporting him. So, I mean...
But the same people said he was evil. Rumsfeld and Powell.
It's Orwellian.
What would you say to people who say, but Owen, you're being naive, right? This is great kumbaya stuff. We must stick to our principles and be progressives. But in the real world, there's power. And the power was with the imperialist side, the power is with the Israelis, the power is with the US, and quote unquote, the axis of resistance was resisting that power. And they have been weakened, and everything that we've seen over the last year, this is the argument, everything that we've seen over the last year, Hamas losing its leaders, Hezbollah losing its leader, Iran being attacked by Israel, Syria losing Assad, the axis of resistance, quote unquote, is now weakened, and that's bad for the Palestinians.
Well, I think the two things to say there is, firstly, what was Assad actually meaningfully, tangibly doing for the Palestinian people? Why, I don't think the Palestinian people are stupid. Why did the polling consistently show if he was...
Well, he attacked Palestinians in Yarmouk, which people airbrush out.
Exactly. And actually, an estimated several hundred Palestinians were tortured to death by the Syrian regime. The Palestinian prisoners being released now, it should be said, from Syrian jails. That I just don't think the evidence is there. But people now, you got the pro-Assad people going, why aren't the rebels attacking Israel? It's like, well, Assad didn't do that either. I mean, the Golan Heights is occupied Syrian territory
since 1967,
and the 1974 ceasefire agreement has held ever since. What I would say, the other point though, is just actually the practical point. I mean, I obviously think Syria is an abhorrent regime as a moral question, but the other point is these regimes always fall. You cannot bet the house or try and if you end up believing that your saviors are literally always dictatorships which are always condemned to inevitably being overthrown because they will always lose the acquiescence of a population they terrorize, then you're doomed because they're going to fall. They're going to fail. One day, I have to say it, the Iranian regime, does everyone think that's going to last forever? Well, actually, I want an Iran which is free of Western imperialism, but free of all forms of oppression. And that's the point. We need to have,
it's a bigger point than that. It's not just that they're dictatorships. It's this idea that everyone is in it for themselves. I mean, nobody cares about the Palestinians. That's why the Palestinians have been screwed from all sides for years. I feel it's a little bit naive to think that there's going to be some savior coming, whether it's China. And to go back to your point about Hungary in 1956, there was this sense, right, in the Western left that first Russia, and then some people now say China, will be the people who come save us.
The tragedy is, I mean, again, I'm not a Stalinist. It's just important clarification. The tragedy that with the Middle East is, in the Cold War, when you have these moments of decolonization, a lot of those movements of national liberation and decolonization had the support of the Soviet Union, but that often twisted their politics in unhelpful ways. But the problem is when that declined, it often, Islamist movements filled that vacuum, didn't they? Or religious fundamentalism in other contexts as well. What we need is we need an anti-imperialism which is also about consistent liberation, not dictators because the point with Assad is he used that rhetoric, didn't he, for legitimacy rather than actually practical help for the Palestinians.
Also, we need to start from first principles every time, which is basic human rights, equal dignity, democracy. And if that's not there, then we don't support it.
Yeah, why are we even here? Why are we here?
I mean, does that make us fundamentalists if we say there's some fundamentals to life, which is you must subscribe to these principles? I mean, I hear a lot of people on the left play the anti-imperialist card and say, well, I saw one writer recently referred to, the world is a chessboard and all of us are pawns or pieces. And that is the way Kissinger looked at the world. That's the way
realpolitik.
Yeah, Zbigniew Brzezinski I think he wrote a whole book called The Grand Chessboard. But we shouldn't accept that framing. That, as you said earlier, by doing that, you're stripping people of agency. Yes, Israel may benefit from the fall of Assad, and we can talk about what Israel's doing in a moment. And yes, the United States did want Assad to fall and spent millions of dollars. But so did Syrian people, and we shouldn't strip them of their agency and their desires. The fact that it coincides with some imperial... is my short answer to that. Watching people being freed from torture chambers and gulags, prisons being emptied out, that's worth it. Well, just see that. That's worth it.
Because also then there's at least because, there is breathing space for the Syrian people to come up at least, potentially, with something which is more consistent in terms of fighting the domination of Western powers and all powers, because they don't want to be the battleground for...
That's the big thing.
But the other point is...
and neither of us, just to be clear, for the bad faith actors, are romanticizing Jolani or HTS.
No, but that's the point.
They could be awful. It could be a horrible regime.
I'm obviously very worried about it. They're reactionaries. They're not in
minorities,
any way.
Alawites, Shias, Christians, Druze are very worried.
And I hope they're replaced by an actual consistent movement which is based on...
And a lot of Syrians are fighting for that.
But that's my worry. The other point is that I do think sometimes this, and I can see a lot of Arab and Muslim commentators saying this, they're seeing a tinge of racism, which seems to suggest that Arab peoples are culturally incapable of being free. Because when people invoke Iraq, that was invaded by the West with catastrophic consequences, or they invoke Libya and go, well, Syria will end up like Libya. And I don't want to, like, Libya was a disaster, but I mean, Syria was also a disaster for the last few years. It's not
way more people died in Syria.
No, I mean, that's the thing. I don't know why people say that.
It's just, by the way, you mentioned kind of the tinge of racism and the use of Arabs. Someone we both know who has long been identified with the Palestinian cause and the Arab cause and was a hero in many Muslim communities, got elected in a lot of Muslim areas of the UK. George Galloway came out this week and said something very curious. I'm going to play the clip.
That part of my life, fighting for the Arabs, with the Arabs, behind the Arabs, alongside them, I feel that period has now ended. I think the Arabs are a lost cause, frankly.
He's done with the Arabs, Owen.
Done with the Arabs. That's it. Oh, they've really let him down, haven't they? I hope they go away and think long and hard about what they've done to
George Galloway.
Like, had they not thought this through?
I think they should do. Arab League needs to do a collective apology.
Yeah, I mean, poor old Galloway. It really sums it up, doesn't it? I mean, he's an interesting kettle of fish, I'll be honest with you, because if you look at the so-called Workers' Party, which he is the leader of, I mean, look, he voted Conservative in Scotland in 2021 as a kind of as a pro-British Union angle. The Workers' Party of Great Britain want a referendum on net zero because they're climate skeptics. They want to increase. He went on GB News to say we need to send out battleships, the Navy ships to deter migrants and refugees from crossing, and he denounces men of fighting age coming over.
But on this specific issue, the thing about Galloway, you could always say, oh, he's horrible on all these issues, but he's good on Palestine, right? You could always say that, like, as a consistent theme. But it seems like apparently Palestine, Syria, again, this is just a chessboard. They're just pawns in some broader political.
But why is he? What's he actually saying here? He's saying, well, the Arabs have let me down because they didn't want to be ruled by Bashar. I mean, Assad. What's his argument? I don't, then he says, well, I never gave up on the Palestinians. I mean, they're Arabs. I don't know what's he talking about.
But it's his sweeping statements about entire groups of people, which is the definition of bigotry.
But it was worse than that. He spoke about in that there's the same show. I watched it. And he was talking about the Uyghurs and others, who aren't. He said they've never even had, they've never eaten Syrian food. They eat rice. They're Chinamen.
Oh, because Uyghur fighters were on the side of.
What do you call them? Chinamen. Chinamen.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned Uyghurs in the context of Syria, but that's another classic example where a lot of leftists will say what's happening in Kashmir is bad. What's happening in Gaza is bad. What's happening in X, Y, Z is bad. China, Uyghurs, that's all a CIA conspiracy. I get that all the time. I've written about Uyghurs and Xinjiang for years. And it's very funny. I interviewed the Greens vice presidential candidate, Butch Ware, a few weeks ago. And he went out and did another interview straight after, and he talked about Uyghur oppression. And all the comments from his own followers were like, oh, you've been brainwashed by the CIA. And it was like, you'd be eaten by your own. But it was like, that, for me, is another example of, to be anti-imperial, you have to be pro-Chinese repression of Muslim communities.
The same with Putin.
What the hell's going on here?
Putin wiped Chechnya off the face of the earth, killing huge numbers of Muslims. At the time, by the way, the West indulged that and portrayed it as part of the kind of war on terror. I mean, that he was portrayed as a reformer at the time and committed actually worse atrocities than have been committed in terms of proportionately against the people of Ukraine, as hideous as that is. Yeah, I mean, for me, again, it's about consistency. I do think there's the argument, because sometimes you get why don't we focus as much on that as we're talking about Israel and other
That's so cynical.
Well, the reason it is because we have leverage. We're Westerners.
Yes.
We have leverage over our own governments.
Agreed.
We don't have leverage over
I've
these
seen
others.
you on debates, and I've had to say there were people like, why aren't you protesting? Piers Morgan does it. Like, why aren't you protesting against Iran or Saudi Arabia? Like Iran, right? Well, how would a protest against Iran affect the Iranian government? What would people standing on the British... Like, what are we going to do? Stop selling Iran all of the weapons we sell?
No, whereas in this country, I mean, you can see, the consequence, it has put pressure actually on the Labour Party. They lost seats over Gaza in an election which was supposed to be handed them on a plate. It's put them under pressure where they've actually had to do concessions, nowhere near enough, because they're still facilitating genocide, not giving the components for F-35 jets to continue raining murder on the people of Gaza. But I mean, that's the point. You focus, and this is what anti-imperialism teaches us, you focus on the crimes committed in your name by your elites in your own country where you have power. Yes. But that doesn't mean you just whitewash or ignore other crimes and pretend they're not happening.
Just deal with one specific issue that's come to light here in the UK with Ed Miliband, who was the Labour leader back when Assad was being accused of chemical attacks and red line of Obama was being crossed. I think it was 2013, if memory serves serves me correctly, he's now a minister in Keir Starmer's government, but he was leader of the Labour Party, and he famously refused to go along with the Conservative Prime Minister at that time, David Cameron, and support airstrikes against Syria. And the vote failed in Parliament. I remember I was working at HuffPost at the time, and it was a big deal. He was asked recently, well, did you get that wrong now that Assad's fallen? If you had just done that, joined those airstrikes in 2013, we could have got rid of Assad earlier. Did the left, in opposing Western military intervention in Syria, airstrikes, no-fly zones, maybe boots on the ground, did the left fail Syria?
No, I mean, he was absolutely right. He brushed that aside and said, firstly, Assad wouldn't have fallen. I wrote actually a piece 3 years after that, making that case, arguing, because I remember the fall of Aleppo at the time under terrible Russian bombardment, and people say, because it kept coming up every time there was a disaster. If only we'd intervened.
Yes. There's a cost to inaction. Tony Blair.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we did. Firstly, the West repeatedly bombed Syria. The West has bombed Syria over and over and over and over again, and actually
Trump bombed Syria.
Yeah, I mean, and the point Ed Miliband made is when those subsequent bombings happened, Assad didn't fall.
That's a very good point.
I mean, the point is, even if that bombing had happened, what it would have been is a targeted punishment. It's a reprimand. That was the idea. What would have happened? Who would have taken over Syria? What's the argument? I don't even know what the argument is.
Yes.
So
that he was so brittle, he just would have imploded. I don't know.
It made no coherent sense whatsoever. And actually, a lot of that is, to be honest, and this is actually quite grim, and it just shows the sort of people running the Labour Party are just so grim. They're not interested in that. They're fighting a faction fight. They don't like Ed Miliband because he's, not to the right of Genghis Khan like the rest of them, and he's actually doing some interesting stuff on climate and public ownership.
So relitigate the Syria.
So they're just trying to
stuff.
find a way of damaging him, and they're using Syria as a cudgel. They're using it, and that is just using.
They're bad faith actors. But what would you say to a good faith actor, a Syrian who says, "I feel let down by the left"?
Well, I think a lot of Syrians are look, as we discussed, some people, certainly vocal people. I don't think of most people. When we say the left, I don't know.
Yeah, you make a good point. Like a lot
who
of this
do
is
we mean?
Twitter.
I'm on the left. You're on the left.
People,
most people I know on the left didn't take this position.
Weren't cheering for Assad.
No, they weren't. It's very few people.
Social
who
media
were.
disproportionately amplifies certain voices.
We get Twitter brain, and then we just focus on these people. But I think actually, but I think a lot of Syrians did get upset about that and about those voices, and certain, I would say, American journalists who, in some cases, interestingly, were very anti-Assad, and then suddenly started, shifted very dramatically, I would say, in the US. But that annoyed people. I would say if people thought Western bombing campaigns would have worked, they haven't worked anywhere in the Middle East or the Arab world or the Muslim world. Every single one has been a catastrophe. So the argument is this would be the one success, but what's the evidence for that?
No, that's a good point. Well, there is, talking of bombing campaigns before we run out of time, there is a bombing campaign going on in Syria right now. It's the Israeli bombing campaign. It's a ferocious bombing campaign. You would not know it from the media coverage in the West that they have carried out literally hundreds of airstrikes on Syrian military positions, not just chemical weapon sites, but general army bases, ships, navies, ports. They've basically disarmed Syria. They basically made sure that whoever governs Syria, there will be no... Because remember, only one country in the Middle East has a right to defend itself. No one else does. So Syria no longer has a right or an ability to defend itself. But they also invaded
it. I mean, they've already occupied...
They know that... Owen, they're creating a buffer zone for their buffer zone.
And then they'll need another buffer zone for the former buffer zone.
And then a buffer zone for that.
Because you saw, again, the Labour, talking about, the ghouls of the Labour Party, because Pat McFadden, who is a cabinet minister close to Keir Starmer, one of the key figures, defended this, saying, well, Israel is defending the Golan Heights, and we always support Israel's right to defend itself.
Golan Heights is not Israel.
It's not Israel. It's illegally occupied Syrian land. But, this just shows... most of our media won't say they've even invaded, will they? No. They won't use the word invaded.
Incursion.
Oh, my
temporary movement. What's interesting about the word temporary is, did you notice that a lot of British and American officials, when asked, said, the Israelis say it's temporary. Netanyahu said it was temporary in English. In his Hebrew remarks, he did not say the word temporary, which is funny because for years, the Israelis used to be like, Arafat says one thing in English, but another thing in Arabic. Classic every accusation is a confession. Netanyahu is saying different things in Hebrew.
This has happened all the way through, particularly the genocide, which is... Israeli leaders and officials will just say in Hebrew, ha ha ha, we're going to wipe up Gaza, we'll wipe it off, we'll kill all the Palestinians, woo, they're all guilty, they're all collectively guilty, we're going to starve you, ha ha ha.
And then one line.
Yeah, and then into Western audiences go, of course you tried to defend civilians. And then the Western media politicians just quote them as though, and they don't quote the statements to the actual audience.
There was a really good tweet about someone saying that if you really want to be radicalized on Palestine, you just need to hit the translate button on Twitter.
Honestly.
on all the Israeli politicians and pundits who say genocidal shit.
Also, you need to just take it, go for a walk afterwards. You get some occasionally, like an Israeli citizen who'll tweet something like, maybe we shouldn't be killing as many children as we are. And then you get the responses going, no, kill more of them.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, they're very brave. They're brave because they're, I'm afraid, exceptions, Israeli voices who do speak out, and they'll be vindicated in the end. But it's genocidal mania. I mean, because it's impunity. Because there's nothing stopping it.
I mean, why wouldn't you go into Syria if you're Netanyahu? You've done everything else you wanted to. You've wiped out Gaza. You've bombed Iran. You've invaded Lebanon. Why not Syria?
I know.
What's the argument against it?
Mission accomplished. I mean, I think, as George W. Bush unfurled that famous banner, I think what we're seeing is hubris. I think at the moment Israel is full of triumphalism because they think they've got away with essentially everything, and it's all fallen.
You don't think they have gotten away? There's a lot of think pieces out now saying Israel transformed the Middle East over the last 6 months. It's become a dominant power. It's in a very strong position. Iran is licking its wounds.
You can't unleash the level of violence and terror and war crimes of the scale Israel has committed without creating generations of horror, and that's what's going to happen. I don't think people realise I don't think any of us realise how, the consequences are going to be unpredictable. In the here and now, yeah, of course. In the Roman Empire, you create they created a wasteland and they called it peace.
Yes.
Or they created a desert and they called it peace.
Or they might borrow the line from the US Army in Vietnam with Syria. We had to burn down the village to save it. Exactly. That's what we did in Syria. You got Elon Levy, our old friend, saying that the West can thank us for what we just did in Syria.
Well, yeah, of course they did. But then again, to be fair, the reason they're dismantling I'm surprised he said that because he's also denouncing them as al-Qaeda terrorists.
No, but that's why he's saying their argument is we're getting rid of all the weapons and chemical weapons that al-Qaeda would get. You can thank us later for this anti-terror operation. There's just no legal justification. I think I saw some law professor say the other day, there's never been an example of a country literally going into another country and destroying its entire military with no provocation. Like, there's no self-defense argument at all.
No, I mean,
this is not even preemptive war. It's not preventive war. It's just.
But also, the new Syrian government has issued their first.
So we want to be neutral.
Well, no, but they issued a complaint to the Security Council, calling it aggression and all the rest of it, which is again very, very little coverage whatsoever. The fact that the new Syrian government has denounced being invaded.
If we went outside and stopped someone on the random street in London and said, "Do you know that Israel is bombing the shit out of Syria?" I don't think they'll ever do.
Very few people. If you said invaded, what do you think about Israel's invasion of Syria? They'll be like, "What? Excuse me?"
Yeah.
I mean, that's
a complete failure of our media and political class.
But they've wiped out much of southern Lebanon, wiped Gaza off the face of the earth, pogrom in the West Bank, invaded Syria. I mean, it's
made a mockery of international law and the post-war settlement.
Well, that's the West.
That's the repercussions that are going to hit us for years.
And the West is determined to just destroy whatever, even the flawed international order,
for the sake of Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir,
and protecting genocide.
On that depressing note,
what a low point.
We will bring the conversation to an end. Owen, it's always a pleasure. I'm Mehdi Hasan.
I'm Owen Jones,
and we're too outspoken.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.